Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the body-worn camera webinar today on addressing officer BWC concerns. My name is Samantha and I work with CNA. Today, Tom Woodmansey, one of our BWC subject experts, will be facilitating our webinar. So I will turn it over to Tom to give opening remarks. Tom?
Well, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. The title of the webinar is to address officer safety concerns and getting buy-in and acceptance with your body-worn camera program. As Sam mentioned, my name is Tom Woodmansey. I'm a senior advisor for CNA, and I work with BJA's body-worn camera technical assistance program, and I'm also a retired police officer. I'm really pleased to be facilitating today's webinar and excited to have an outstanding panel of presenters. So throughout the evolution of the body-worn camera policy implementation program, we've heard and learned a lot about how officers perceived, resisted, and embraced body-worn camera. As we all know, body-worn camera is growing and officers know that it's here to stay, but there remain some challenges for agencies to address. And we hope to provide you with some insights and strategies to help with promoting the benefits of body-worn camera to your officers. Today's webinar is going to cover the important topic of officers understanding what their potential reluctance may be based upon, the resistance to body-worn camera, along with some helpful information and strategies on how to achieve improved buy-in and acceptance. You'll hear from an expert panel including a body-worn camera researcher, a police sergeant, a police chief, and an attorney for police unions. So this webinar is another in a series of webinars sponsored by BJA and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. We want to thank BJA for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program, the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and in a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies around the country who are implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, county, local, and tribal enforcement agencies in many ways, and we are very grateful that they do so. We also want to thank the staff at CNA for their efforts in putting this webinar together. So just a few comments before we begin for your awareness. Please take a moment to make sure your phones are on mute during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded for the benefit of others who want to view it later and posted on our website. We've actually had some questions come in already about the webinar and the topic, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar as well. So please make your thoughts and questions known. If you'd like, you can use the chat utility to the right of your screen to post your questions and comments, or you can comment at the end of the webinar. We'll do our best to respond to your input and questions. Following the webinar, you're going to receive a request to evaluate it, so please complete this evaluation and give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. And importantly, let us know if you have any other topics that you think we should cover in the future. So with that, I'd like to just provide a brief bio on the outstanding panel that we have, some background information. I'm going to start with Jan Gobb. Dr. Gobb is an assistant professor of criminal justice at East Carolina University. She earned her PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Arizona State University in 2015. Jan serves as a subject expert for BJA's body-worn camera policy and implementation program. Her research is focused on contemporary issues in policing that include misconduct, technology, use of force, and the intersection of gender and policing. And Jan has been published in outlets such as Criminology and Public Policy and Police Quarterly. Jan is very much a go-to person in our cadre of subject experts with her body-worn camera program, and we're happy to have her on this. Adam Bell. Sergeant Bell has 13 years of law enforcement experience with Greensboro Police Department. Previous assignments for the sergeant included patrol, vice narcotics, the tactical narcotics team, and their special response team. Adam was assigned to Professional Standards Division in 2015 and began assisting with their body-worn camera program in 2016, and he's now the full-time body-worn camera administrator for the department. I had the pleasure of working with Sergeant Bell over the past year with the Greensboro Body-Worn Camera Policy Implementation Program, and I know that he's very knowledgeable and will be a great presenter for today's webinar. Sean Smoot, Attorney Smoot, is the Managing Principal Consultant of 21st Century Policing Solutions Company. He is a nationally recognized expert regarding police-related topics, and he speaks frequently at state, national, and international forums regarding community policing, public safety, and public employee labor issues. Mr. Smoot serves as the Director and Chief Counsel for the Police Benevolent and Protective Associations of Illinois and the State Police Labor Committee. He holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Illinois State University, a law degree from Southern Illinois University School of Law, and certificates in police leadership from Harvard University. I also had the privilege to work on a 2-year project with Mr. Smoot, and I can tell you he is in high demand for a variety of police topics. Lastly, Ken Roski. Ken Roski is the Deputy Chief of Police at Pasco, Washington Police Department and has been a police officer with the department since 1986, where he has a wide range of experiences. Chief Roski currently oversees the internal department operations, the public information officer, and the department social media project. He coordinated the department's critical response technical assistance project with the COPS office, where the initial review of body-worn cameras was started. Chief Roski did this partly as an opportunity to rebuild community trust following a controversial officer-involved shooting at his agency. Deputy Chief Roski holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice management and a master's degree in organizational leadership. He is a graduate of the Northwestern Law Enforcement Executive Command College and also the FBI National Academy. So with that, you can tell we have some outstanding panelists. And before I turn it over to them, I'd just like to make one comment on the importance of the webinar. You know, as we learn more and more about the benefits of providing information on body-worn cameras to officers, there appears to be more acceptance by officers around the country, and more agencies are adopting them. Some officers, though, still view body-worn camera as purely a means to have oversight and scrutinize their behavior. But you'll hear from this panel that body-worn camera can have a positive impact on officers in so many ways. So with that, I'd like to kick off our webinar and start off with Dr. Gobb. So Jan, go ahead and take over, please.
So I will start with saying that what I'm going to present here today is based on based on research that has been done by myself and Dr. Mike White at Arizona State University as part of our outcome directories. 2 outcome directories are already in existence for use of force and citizen complaints, and those are available on the TTA website. The visual directory of the state of the research on various outcomes of interest. And like I said, use of force and complaints are already there, and the next one is officer perception. So this will eventually be in an Excel spreadsheet format that everyone can see, but this will be a little bit of a sneak peek for that directory. So there are 31 articles that cover 22 different jurisdictions that address issues of officer perception. It's important to realize that in 2014, so roughly the time of Ferguson and a few other high-profile incidents, there were only 4. 2 of them were agency reports in Victoria, Canada, and Mesa, Arizona, and then 2 were scholarly studies in Phoenix and Orlando. So in 2014, when agencies really started looking at trying to get body-worn cameras and the momentum really grew, there were only four studies and reports to guide agencies in how they were going to be perceived by their officers. So since then, we have quite a few more, obviously, 31 articles in 22 jurisdictions. Studies in 6 jurisdictions have assessed perceptions both before and after body-worn camera deployment, both in Canada and the United States. The rest looked at either perceptions only before or after. The pre-post methodology allows us to assess change in perception. So how do officers perceive them before they get cameras, and then how do those perceptions change once they get them and have some experience with them? So those pre-post perception changes are really important. The methods that scholars have used have varied. Surveys are certainly very popular. Definitely some online surveys, and then some that are in-person. So in-person surveys typically are going to be conducted and during roll calls. You know, a researcher will come in, they'll have probably paper pencil type surveys, and they're going to, you know, fill it out. They can feel the survey in their hand, and then, you know, the officer's going to fill it out. the online surveys, they would go through email or something to that effect. So 20 jurisdictions used surveys. 6 of them were done online. 9 jurisdictions used either interviews or focus groups. So interviews is a one-on-one, a scholar is interviewing one person. Focus groups will be 2 or more people in the room. And interviews and focus groups really helped people to understand the why. So the survey tells us what the officers think, and the interviews and focus groups really help us to delve deeper and understand why they think the way they do. Gives us a little bit more nuance. Certainly, some scholars have looked at the mixed methods approach, so doing both a survey and a focus group, or surveys and interviews. We've covered a range of officer groups. Patrol is the most common. That's logical. 19 jurisdictions looked at patrol. They are the end users, of course, of the technology, so it makes sense to understand what the officers themselves believe. But we've also, 10 jurisdictions have looked at supervisors and or command staff. It's also important to understand, why departments get cameras. So, the command staff kind of can shed light on that, but also supervisors, sergeants, lieutenants, how they perceive cameras and what they perceive as to be the benefits and drawbacks of them is important. 3 jurisdictions have dealt specifically with the use of cameras in specialty units. And so they have a different mission than general patrol, and so they tend to have a little bit of a different perspective. Can you change the slide for me, Sam? So overall, officers are pretty positive about body cameras. The benefits, of course, including evidentiary value. They absolutely see the value of the evidence that they are collecting through the camera, and they also they view them as reducing citizen complaints. They acknowledge that change, and certainly when it helps to reduce the time that's taken in dealing with complaints or reduces simply the number of complaints they receive, they view that as a benefit. Officers tend to believe that they have a benefit of officer safety and citizen safety, everyone, that civilizing effect that everyone acts, either acts better or it kind of cools everyone down a little bit, and so there's an element of officer safety. There's a little bit of mixed finding there, but by and large, officers tend to think that they enhance officer safety to some degree. And many of them find that they are easy to use or comfortable to use. The technology itself is typically not particularly complex piece of technology, the camera itself, but there are certainly little tweaks that they don't like or quirks about them. Double tapping to turn a camera on or something like that, sometimes it bothers them, but generally they find them pretty easy to use. There are mixed findings on 2 important things, the impact on citizen behavior and officer behavior. So citizen behavior, a lot of people went into this believing that body cameras were going to make citizens be less aggressive, more cooperative. And certainly some officers do believe that citizens act better. But there are several studies that find that officers don't think that they do. And it's not that they don't think that they act better, that they act worse. They think that there's no difference. And so they don't really see a difference in how citizens are responding to them simply by having the camera. These are typically tied to 2 things. The first is an understanding of people that police are encountering. They're not encountering people on the best day of their life. They're encountering them on what may be the worst day of their life. And so they're dealing with people who are probably very angry, might be frustrated, could be hurt, could be scared, could be mentally ill and in crisis. They may be intoxicated in some way. And so there's a wide range of people that they're engaging with. And so they may not be able to really rationally change their behavior simply because there's a camera present. Additionally, it can be tied to the department policy related to citizen notification. Many agencies do not require their officers to notify citizens that there is a camera and it's recording, and some of them say that you can. They say you can do it, but you don't have to do it. And so a lot of officers don't. And so if the citizen doesn't know that there is a camera there, then obviously there's no opportunity for them to change their behavior. Related to officer behavior, there are some mixed findings related to those effects. Some believe that body cameras negatively impact discretion, will make officers less likely to use force even when it's justified. So some semblance of hesitation, that especially among newer officers, that they might hesitate to use force that they're justified in using. Some believe that it will make officers less proactive, but there is some research that shows officers think it will have a greater impact on others' behavior relative to their own. So, as is the case often, people think it will affect other people more than it will affect themselves. There is a little bit of mixed effects with these. Not all officers view it this way, but there is certainly some research to show that there's this question, especially the hesitation related to use of force. We hear that anecdotally as well as in the research findings. Two things that I'd like to note. The first is that officers voice concern about how the department will use footage, when it can be viewed, who can view it, how it's going to be released, things like that. And it's typically linked to a concern of fishing expeditions to jam up officers. And so this can be largely avoided with two things. The first is a very clear written policy as to who can view footage, when that will be done, how it's released, under what circumstances it's released, that kind of thing. And also the inclusion of line officers in the policy development. So if you include officers in the development of this policy, then they feel like there's a stake and they're vested in that outcome. And that's just true generally. You include people in the process, and certainly they have a little bit of a vested interest in the outcome. Second thing is that officers are also concerned with how body camera footage will be released and its use outside of the department. So this kind of public perception of footage. Certainly when a 10-minute video is released and the news shows 5 seconds of it, there's that kind of question, or that you have links to the footage and people view it, and then but people aren't necessarily trained in police tactics and things like that, so may not understand that a completely justified use of force just looks really bad on footage, and so they have this concern about how that's going to be viewed. And so there's no great solution here. This is especially true among specialized units, and so units like K9 or gang units or units that tend to use a little bit more force, certainly not, we might expect that would be the case, but they may use more force or use more like higher levels of force. You might have a separate policy related to those units. There are other ways to kind of to deal with that issue, but there's not a really great solution with how to deal with the public perception of body camera footage, but it is a legitimate concern that a lot of officers have. And that's all I have, so I will pass it on to Sergeant Bell.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Adam Bell. I'm a sergeant with the Greensboro Police Department here in North Carolina. I appreciate being a part of this panel. I've been involved in various different roles with our camera program, from being in patrol, supervisor in patrol, being on the administrative side with internal affairs, and now as the camera program administrator. So I've kind of seen every side of it as far as the rollout would be inside your department, inside our department. But a little bit about our agency, just to give you an idea of who we are. I do think the size of the agency can matter as far as the logistics go of how you plan your program and roll out your program as far as the equipment and logistic issues. But we're a medium-sized city, medium-sized department. We've got 675 sworn employees. We see about 220,000 calls a year. Our BWC program began back in 2013. At the time, we went with a head-mounted option, which could be mounted to the head or the lapel of the uniform. Prior to 2013, we really didn't have any cameras in our department. We had a few cameras that were in our traffic division, but they were in the traffic division only, so there were no cameras in the patrol division. The officers were not used to policing with cameras at all when we began our body-worn camera program. Initially, the only uniformed officers were issued body-worn cameras, and they had to share them. We only had enough cameras for, we didn't have enough cameras for a one-to-one deployment. Each officer didn't have their own. So we saw some logistical issues that came out of that as far as assigning the cameras at the beginning of shift and dropping them off at the end of shift. Technical issues that would happen with the camera. We found that being that each officer wasn't assigned to a camera, their own camera, we found that there was not as much accountability for each camera. If there was some type of technical issue going on with it, we found that the officers would tend to kind of pass the buck to the next guy and grab a different camera. So that was one of the issues that we saw we really didn't see when we started the program. And later on, we have since gone to a deployment where we have one-for-one camera deployment, so the officers are much more accountable for the cameras and getting them fixed and making sure the technology works for them. Again, you'll hear some of these issues echoed probably throughout this presentation, but we saw some of the same concerns that Dr. Gaub has already mentioned. Some of the primary concerns that we saw going into the program from officers was that the recordings would be used to Monday morning quarterback their actions. The BWCs would be used as a big brother tool, as Dr. Gaub described it as somewhat of a fishing expedition tool, where supervisors or somebody else within the command level would go looking through videos behind an officer's performance to see if they can find something on them to discipline them for some reason. That was one of the concerns that we had. Another concern was the activation policy and potential discipline that would come from the activation policy as far as activation of the cameras. The officers had a fear that the department would put more emphasis on the importance of an event being recorded than on understanding that the officer didn't have time or didn't think to turn on the camera before a volatile situation. To address that issue, we had about a 6-month grace period when we first started the camera program, to where if the officer forgot to turn the camera on or it didn't get turned on at all during a call, they weren't disciplined for it unless we saw there was an overt action to make sure it didn't come on. But after 6 months, we did have to start disciplining officers when the camera didn't come on when it was supposed to by policy. But again, we had a grace period to start out with where it was just handled as a performance issue, and that helped kind of ease some of the officers' tensions as they eased into learning the cameras. We now have a policy that assisted with that problem. When we first started the program, the policy just said the camera had to be turned on during certain types of events, but we ended up changing the policy to show that the camera had to be turned on prior to arrival at certain types of calls or all calls for service or initiated activity with citizens for law enforcement function. And that helped with the actual activations of the cameras because the officers were now getting the cameras turned on the way to the call or before they walked up to the citizen. That way they weren't having to remember to turn this camera on after they had started to talk to them and just being one more thing they had to think about. So that assisted with us getting over that hump of officers not activating the cameras. Something else we're doing, we've been doing for the past few years now, is that when we have an academy, we go ahead and issue these cameras to the recruits within the first week of the academy. That way they can get used to turning the camera on, using the camera, and just instilling that muscle memory in them from the get-go when they do their practicals that this is just another tool that they're going to need to use once they hit the street. And we've found that has helped out a lot with our actual compliance with policy and officers getting the cameras activated. Again, some of the officer buy-in strategies that we used when we were highlighting the benefits of the BWC during our rollout to the officers to kind of ease their tensions and get them on board with the camera program was assistance with prosecution. Again, in an age where there's less and less weight carried on the word of an officer, we pointed out that the officers having a factual video recording would help show what happened on the scene, what actions they took, what actions the citizen took. Same for administrative processes. Now we have a factual recording of what happened, and it will help with streamlining the actual time that's used during administrative processes, where we don't have to, in some cases, we don't even have to interview the officers. If the entire call was recorded, we can go back to the recording and see what happened, and in many cases we can clear out some complaints just based on what we see on the recording without having to bring the officer in and put them through the anxiety of coming to internal affairs for a complaint. Parts of training, if there's, when officers go on a certain or a unique call or an event, that we can sometimes use those videos for training for the department. We built into our policy how the videos would be requested to be used for training, where it has to go through several levels of review by the command staff to be used as training, and we don't do it to humiliate the officers. And we had to make sure we underline that when we talked about using it for training, that it's for the betterment of the training of the department, not so much to humiliate a certain officer. We do have something built into the policy where the officer can object to using it for training for that reason if they're humiliated. But again, the department has to look at it to see if the training value outweighs the officer's objections and make a decision if we're going to use it. It'll also help for report accuracy, where the officer can go back and review their videos so they can see what happened on the call, so that they can make sure everything's right in their case report or in their administrative statement, and they can watch as many times as they want to. That's one thing we had to deal with was officers. They had questions about if they're sitting there watching the videos, we have an auditing system. Are we going to go back and see how many times they watched the video and question them about it? And we had to really get over that and let them know that if you're using the videos and watching them for a law enforcement function for the department, do it. Please do it. Please go back and watch it. So we've got to a point where most of the officers do watch their videos before they type reports to make sure we have an accurate report at the end of the day. Again, it's going to help them for civil liabilities for the same reasons it did with the prosecution, where we got a factual basis of a recording. We also pointed out the improved citizen conduct that we're hopefully going to see when the citizens see that we have a camera in our chest and that their conduct's being recorded. And also that the cameras should help in the reduction in citizen complaints and use of force encounters, being that, again, the citizens are hopefully going to see that that camera is recording them during the police interaction, and we're not going to see as many complaints about it. So we had to underline all of these concepts to the officers in our training program when we rolled out the cameras to ease some of their anxieties. In 2016, we transitioned from a head-mounted camera to a chest-mounted camera. All the officers from the rank of lieutenant and down were issued the cameras. We conducted a pre- and post-deployment survey. One of the concerns that we saw in both was that the officers had big concern that they were losing the camera view out of the windshield for when they were driving, with issues concerning if they were involved in a wreck. Now they're not going to have this recording of what traffic signal light they had, or were they in the intersection, or was the other person in the intersection at the time. Emergency driving, pursuits, all of these issues are really true high liability for the officer and the department. And the officers had a lot of concern that they lost that vantage point from when it was on their head, now that it's on their chest and the camera's just looking at the steering wheel. So we knew that that was a big concern going into wearing the body, the actually chest-mounted camera, and after they were actually deployed. And without that survey, we may not have known all of that information. But what the survey did help us with was, being that we knew that that was going to be a concern, we made sure that we took time to talk about that issue during the training and how there were some other factors involved with not having that vantage point outside the windshield that the administrative and prosecutor would have to look at to make sure that the officers were doing right. So we did address that within our training program. 2017, the department received a BGA grant to expand the program to the vehicle cameras. Again, this helped with part of that anxiety about officers not having that viewpoint out of the windshield anymore, to where we're able to get cameras in all of our patrol and traffic enforcement vehicles, where they had a camera looking out the front windshield and a camera now looking into the rear prisoner transport area. The fleet cameras that we now have, they work in conjunction with our body-worn cameras, and the vehicle cameras will actually activate our body-worn cameras. Something we saw that helps our department and the officers stay in compliance with our own policy as far as activations go. So that part of the program, when we developed it, when you're actually activating the cameras for the officer, when they turn on their blue lights or whatever automated triggers you have set up in the car, it's helping the officer not have to think about turning on their own body-worn camera. It's getting turned on for them, which A, keeps them in compliance with our policy, which keeps them out of trouble, and B, it's one less thing they have to think about when they're responding to a volatile call. Some of the testing that we did going into the fleet camera system that we found important, and again, I'll harp on the importance of testing your camera system before you eventually roll it out. We tested the fleet camera system in conjunction with our body-worn cameras for about 6 months. We had a couple cars that we outfit with the camera system, and the benefits that we found from the testing, we found that we had played around with the different mounting options with those cameras. Where we're going to mount the cameras on the car to where we're going to get the best view and capture the most information. We had to work through some IT concerns that we didn't anticipate on the front end, so it was good to test those out for 6 months and get them worked out with our IT and networking folks. Before we rolled them out, where we had a couple hundred cars, we only had 2 cars out there with experiencing these issues, but we were able to identify what the issues were and fix them before we did a huge rollout. Again, our automated activation trigger testing, we were able to see what triggers we wanted on the cars. What is it? Blue lights? Is it lights? Is it weapon lock? Is it speed activation? We had tested using any time that the rear doors were open, that the cameras in the rear would turn on, and we had determined that was more of a problem than anything for us. So that gave us a chance to kind of iron out the issues as far as our automated triggering system goes, and make some changes before we actually, again, did it to a couple hundred cars and regretted it later on. One of the huge benefits of testing it for a certain amount of time is that officers in the field get a pre-deployment inspection of the system. They get to see the system. They get to see how it works when one of their partners are using it. And A, it'll ease some of their anxieties about having the system, and B, they'll be able to provide some of their input about the issues they're seeing with it. We were able to see what about the system made the use of it easy for the officers, and what about it made it hard for the officers to work. So we were able to iron out some of those issues and change our program as we moved along in the testing. And again, without the testing phase, we probably would not have had any of these benefits. So I'm a huge advocate for testing your system ahead of time. Most of the vendors with this camera equipment is more than happy to send you some equipment ahead of time to test out. So just use that technology and use that offer if you can. Some of the lessons we learned, if you can, consult and do a site visit with an agency that has the same equipment that you're going to be going with, so that you can get some recommendations on the type of training that you're going to be looking at, what you need to have in your training, how long is the training probably going to take. Policy, how did they draft their policy? Maybe that'll help you draft your policy before you get going. Pre-deployment setup, is there any unexpected time delays that department saw in setting up the equipment and actually assigning it to cars or assigning it to people that you may not have expected? And also, did they have any other unexpected budgetary concerns, some unseen costs that were built into it that you may not have known about? So you can go ahead and prepare your department for that. And again, understand the budgetary obligations of the program. It's very expensive to purchase. It's very expensive to maintain the recordings. We use a cloud-based system with our vendor, and it is an expensive program to keep running, but we value what we get out of the camera system and our program so much that we're willing to spend that money. So just understand what the budgetary concerns your department is going to be seeing. Who will manage the program? Is it going to be a sworn or non-sworn, or is it going to be housed in your IT department? One thing that we have found, the biggest part of our officer buy-in is to make sure that the equipment works. So wherever you have it assigned, just make sure that whoever's going to be dealing with the equipment is available, and somebody's available to make sure that they can step in and fix whatever issue the officers are having, because if they're having technical challenges or if there's a piece of equipment not working, you're going to see your officer buy-in quickly starting to decline. So that's what we have done with our department, is make sure that the officers are very well served and they have somebody at all hours of the night and weekends and day to make sure that they can keep the equipment up and running. Get the stakeholders involved. Just identify the stakeholders in your jurisdiction involved, such as is there a police union? Is there the prosecutor's office? Is there a civil rights activist group that you commonly work with within the department? Of course, the officers and the chain of command. Make sure everybody understands what this camera program is going to look like. Give them a chance to look at it and voice their concerns so that you can either educate them on it or maybe even implement some changes in how you're going to roll out the policy and the use of the cameras. Are there any local or state laws that govern the use of the body-worn cameras or the recordings? Know what those laws are. And again, you've heard me talk about the testing of it, and I can't harp on that enough. But again, that's a good segue to turn it over to our next presenter, Sean Smoot, for the union perspective. Sean?
Thanks, Sergeant Bell. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Smoot. I'm the Director and Chief Counsel for the PBPA of Illinois, actually speaking to you today from Springfield, Illinois, in fact. And in addition to my duties with the PBPA here, I do a good deal of consulting work across the United States. I'm serving as a federal monitor in both Cleveland and Baltimore currently, and work with a number of departments that are experiencing a lot of challenges in the current time. I also just want to mention, because I'll relate to this somewhat in my presentation, I drafted, for the most part, the body-worn camera legislation that was passed in Illinois in 2015 that actually enabled police to start using body-worn camera technology in our state. Our state's a two-party consent state, so we literally had to change the eavesdropping statute to provide for officers to be able to use this technology. In the course of doing that, we also included in the statute a basic framework for a model policy and what has to be included in terms of a framework for policies on body-worn cameras in the state of Illinois. Dr. Gobb and Sergeant Bell both touched on a number of really important topics, and I just want to briefly hit on those real quick. The idea that the policy is really the key here is if you walk away from this webinar with nothing else, that should be it. So much of what we talk about, so much of the concerns that unions have, that rank and file officers have, can be addressed, and frankly, that the public has, can be addressed with policy. So it's really, truly important to include all of those groups in your policymaking process. The number one fear, I think Dr. Gobb hit on this, as she referred to it as fishing expedition. We call it trolling here, and the number one fear that I see across the country for police officers where this technology is being deployed is the fear that a supervisor is going to have the opportunity to essentially troll their video or sit in a room and just review their video and wait for them to make a mistake. And there are some things that can be done in policy to alleviate those concerns, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So just addressing the benefits of police using body cameras, we found there's a tremendous amount of benefit in terms of using the technology, major reductions in complaints against officers. As you can see from, these are all studies that I'm happy to provide citations to. I think that Tom and I are working on an article that should be published in the next month or so that will include citations to these studies as well. But you can see, I mean, very dramatic reductions in complaints against police officers. You can also see major reductions in the use of force, and particularly at a point that Dr. Gobb made. There isn't a lot of research on this, but where, at least in one study that I've identified that was done in Orlando, they actually asked the officers, what their opinion was in terms of what accounted for the major. They had a over 53% reduction in uses of force, and 30 to 40% of the officers said body-worn cameras really had a de-escalating effect, and credited the camera, just the presence of the camera, with those results. So big concerns that police officers and the associations or unions that represent them have with the technology can be broken down into these kind of major point questions. And when you're gonna, if you're gonna deploy the technology, you strongly recommend that you take this list and think about what you can incorporate in your policy to address these various concerns, and sit down with your union, sit down with your association, and kind of walk through these things. So who's going to be wearing them? In most departments, it's uniformed officers, but then there are always questions about, what's a uniformed officer, because we have tactical units where in my state, several departments have them where the officers wear kind of blue jeans and T-shirts or sweatshirts with the vest in a carrier that identifies them as police. That's their uniform. They're not in a traditional patrol uniform. Should those folks be issued, and should they be wearing the cameras, or SWAT team members, other kinds of modified uniforms? So you kind of nail down who's going to be using these. There are actually some departments now where detectives and crime scene technicians are wearing body-worn cameras. So that's a whole other kind of area that hasn't traditionally been where they haven't traditionally been used. The other thing has just come up before as well. What training is going to be provided to the officers, and this is really a key point. And I can tell you, it's from experience. The only thing worse than not having body cameras is having body cameras and not having the footage from a critical incident, because that not only does it not protect the officer, but it creates this narrative or doubt in the mind of the public that the video's missing because of some bad intention on the part of the officer. So this is really a critical area, and I link it to training because from experience. I think Sergeant Bell talked about how some officers had issues with when they first got them, remembering to activate the cameras. So they put into place a program at his agency where officers start wearing the cameras in the academy. So they just a regular part of their uniform. They build that routine, that muscle memory to activate the cameras. As some of you may be aware, the city of Chicago deployed body-worn cameras about 2 years ago, and shortly after they did a deployment, there was a officer-involved shooting that involved a foot chase. It was fairly controversial, not because of the conduct of the officers or because the person that they wound up in a deadly force confrontation with didn't do something, but because the officer who was primarily the first one on the scene that was involved in the foot chase and who wound up shooting this suspect was wearing a body camera, and there was no video. And so that was, that immediately spun the story in a direction it didn't need to go. And what we discovered after that, in very short order after that, was that officer's first week wearing the camera. And he actually, the reason there was no video is he overactivated the camera during the foot chase. So he exited his vehicle, which had been struck by the offender's vehicle, and started chasing the offender. And instead of double tapping the activation button on his camera, he double tapped it twice, which activated and immediately deactivated the camera. And we were able to discover that because it was an Axon camera, and we sent it to Axon, and they were able to, they can diagnose exactly what happened, and that's exactly what happened. And so it wasn't a matter of the officer not intentionally deactivating the camera. He attempted to activate it, but because he had not been using the equipment for more than a few days, and had just a few days before been trained on it, he didn't have that muscle memory and that familiarity with the technology. So, that's just an example of what happens if your training maybe isn't as thorough as it should be. The other issue, and Sergeant Bell touched on this a little bit, regarding where the body cameras are worn. And so most policies call for it to be worn above the midline of the torso. That's usually kind of almost center mass of the chest. Although sometimes they can be mounted on shoulders. They still are, there are still cameras out there that mount on kind of like sunglasses or head mounts. But the general policy requirement is that it be midline of the torso, so above midline of the torso. So it's really important to remember the last kind of 4 bullet points here on this slide, because the camera is not, first of all, cameras have limitations. They're not as good as the human eye. They don't have the peripheral vision that the human eye does, at least not yet, and I know they're working on that. They don't have, the immediacy of the tilt and the ability to focus quickly in one direction or the other. And they just won't, capture the same thing that the human eye does. And so, having these key points kind of in mind, it's really important both for the officers to understand, and Sergeant Bell talked about getting stakeholders involved. I am a huge proponent of once a department decides that this is a technology they're going to start using, bringing in members of the public, bringing in leaders of community groups, showing them the equipment and explaining to them how it works, because it's really important that people's expectations be realistic. And the realistic expectation should be the camera's not going to pick everything up. It doesn't have the same field of view that an officer's eyes do. And that, these are very high stress, quickly evolving situations. And there's a lot of motion, and sometimes the camera, won't see things exactly as the officer sees them. And I think, if you do a good job educating the public before you have an incident, it's a lot easier to remind them of that after the incident. So the next issue is, when do they activate the cameras? Again, I know a lot of groups have proposed that officers should wear them and they should be on from the start of the shift to the end. That's not usually a practical thing. There are some limitations to that, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But most, if not all, policies that I deal with are manually activated policies. So the officer actually has to activate the cameras. We do have a number of departments now around the country that are utilizing signal technology, which is technology, I think Sergeant Bell, you described this a little bit, technology that you can set. So like if an officer pulls his weapon out of the holster, his camera and every camera within 30 feet activates. If an officer activates his overhead lights and opens the car door, his camera will automatically be activated. So that technology is evolving. It's very good now. It's going to just get better, and it'll be very customizable, so that there are certain things we know officers do that we want to make sure their camera's on for, and they'll be able to make sure that they'll be able to auto activate, so the officer won't even have to think about whether or not his camera is activated. There are other considerations as well, and that gets to legally and policy-wise, when should the cameras not be on? And so, as I mentioned, I come from a state where it's two-party consent. Now, we got that taken care of before we deployed the technology, but in some states, it's still required. You have to tell the person that you're recording them at a minimum. In some places, you may have to tell them and then ask them if that's okay. In my state, and in I think most states, it's unlawful to videotape a juvenile. So, you have a situation where you're called to a school. The officer may need to deactivate the camera to prevent illegally recording juveniles. HIPAA issues, if an officer responds to a call in a hospital. Again, you walk through an emergency room, you could be collecting all kinds of HIPAA-protected data. So that's something that has to be kept in mind. And then in many states, there are laws that give an extra kind of layer of privacy protection for when police enter a person's residence, so or other place where they may have an expectation of privacy. So these are all issues that have to be kind of addressed in your policy, and have to really be thought through before you deploy the technology. And finally, again, working around the country, I've only seen one camera manufacturer that has a battery life that will last an entire shift. So that's a big limitation on having cameras on all the time. And the other consideration is a cost one, and that's one I know people are very sensitive to, particularly when it comes to data storage. And if you're recording an entire shift, you're taking up a lot of data, and that data's got to be stored. And most storage, there may be some vendors out there that do unlimited data storage, but I think there are some vendors where you actually pay, so based on how much you store, so that can get very expensive very fast. Who can use this stuff? Again, I want to bring up this issue of trolling because I think it falls into place here. Who gets to use what's recorded and for what purpose? And this was a major issue. One of the first departments in the United States to deploy body-worn cameras was Fort Worth Police Department. And I talked to the guy who was the chief at the time, Jeff Halstead, about how he got the officers to buy in, because I also knew the union president at the time, and knew that this was a very controversial deployment. So in addressing the trolling issue, the chief actually put out a memorandum, and I don't think there's a lot of chiefs that would do this, but the chief actually put out a memorandum to all supervisors. If they were caught trolling an officer's video and recommended discipline on that officer, he would not discipline the officer and would discipline the supervisor with double the discipline that they recommended on the officer. And that kind of allayed the fears of the officers pretty quickly. The other thing they did, which I think, and I recommend that departments do, is they reached an agreement, and they actually incorporated into a written agreement between the city and the police association there to allow for auditing of officers' video. And their auditing program essentially allowed and put the officers on notice that 15 minutes of their video would be reviewed by a supervisor, not in their direct line of supervision, once every quarter. So officers know once every quarter, a sergeant or lieutenant from another shift who's not in their direct line of supervision can pull 15 minutes randomly of their video, watch it, and then if they identify an issue, they call the officer in, they talk to him about the issue, maybe why'd you approach a vehicle that way or whatever. 98% of the time there's no issues, and they get a memo saying, this is Lieutenant Smoot, I reviewed 15 minutes of your video, I didn't see any problems. So, but that's a really good way of kind of handling it, and everybody knows what the rules are, and if the employer follows it and the officers know, it just seems to be working out really well. Sergeant Bell talked about use of training. That's becoming more and more common. It's a great tool. We leave a lot on the table when we don't use it, and probably repeat a lot of mistakes if we're not using it. But there are issues about the officer and whether that's their consent is necessary. Most places it's not. Again, and finally, this is another big issue for officers and for unions associations. Should officers be allowed to review their video before they make a statement or write a report? And by and large, the policies are, and the state law here is absolutely the officer can review their video before they write a report or give a statement. It's kind of like we we refer to it, police officers being called as an expert witness. Well, you wouldn't call an expert witness that didn't have the opportunity to review their own records and their and the evidence first. So that has been a kind of a non-issue in Illinois, but it is an issue in other places. And then how long does the data? How long should it be stored? Best practice is to store it. If it's not evidentiary, to store it for a limited period of time. That can be 90 days, 180 days, after which it gets deleted. And that actually is we followed what we had previously been doing just for dash cameras in our state, which is its evidentiary value. That's a pretty good way to handle it. It does reduce the cost in terms of what you're paying for memory and data storage, and it also it puts some of the civil rights folks at ease that if somebody's captured on video. I think Dr. Gobb mentioned you're probably not encountering them on their best day. That that video is not going to be out in the ether for the rest of their life, and it also is helpful to the department to not have to administer and maintain that information for a long time. Our body-worn camera videos public records. In most states they are, but they have the same protections that other public records do, which means they typically wouldn't get, especially if it's video that's like in someone's house or someplace where they have an expectation of privacy. It wouldn't be disclosed unless it's disclosed in an evidentiary fashion. With that, I look forward to any questions you have, and I will turn it over to my good friend, Ken Roski from Pasco.
Pasco Police Department. I serve as the deputy chief in the organization right now, and we started our research on body-worn cameras following a controversial shooting in 2015. In fact, Sean Smoot was out here and helped us following that as we worked through some technical projects, and so it's good to have Sean back on a project with me. So one of the things that we wanted to do is we started down this initial road of body-worn cameras was, I'm trying to get my clicker to work here. Oh, there it goes. One of the things we wanted to initially do was find an opportunity to engage some of the community groups and focus on ensuring our confidence and trust was not lost, and or that we reestablished that trust with those organizations in our community. And you'll note on one of the comments there that we actually even sought out the ACLU and invited them to be part of our discussions with the community and some of those groups. And we thought it was very important that as we moved down this road that we included as many stakeholders in the community that we could prior to even engaging our officers. So part of the discussion initially was with community groups and what was their feeling towards it. And to be honest with you, it was all over the board. There were concerns about privacy issues, and of course our officers had those same concerns. And so we did a slow approach and moved cautiously forward with engaging as many groups as we could. We identified cost concerns, equipment and data, storage, whether that would be stored in-house or in the cloud, which vendors we would go with. We looked at donations that the public wanted to give us versus grant funding versus general budget items. So we had a whole gathering of different resources, not only with the equipment and how we were going to fund it. Our agency was not foreign to technology. We were the first in the region many years ago to go to dash cameras, and in fact we maintained our dash camera, still have our dash camera project. That's over 20 years now. So technology like that, mobile data terminals in the day, and future technology has never been something that we've shied away from. So the agency as a whole was accustomed to looking at this kind of project. We did put a couple of things that we wanted to see happen if we went down this road. We wanted a total inclusion of all of the technology when that came to analyzing video from a forensic standpoint, all the way to making sure our officers had one camera and they weren't having to high-five in the squad room or in the parking lot and pass cameras off and hope that that camera had been charged. The officer, the shift coming off, hadn't used it too much. They're going to be in the middle of their shift and it go dead, or they have to go back and charge it. So some of the minimum requirements that we identified early on was that we wanted our officers to have that piece of equipment to them, and that they could be responsible for that, and they weren't having to worry about a pass off. Like Sergeant Bell had talked about, and Sean as well, we had to address some state laws, and in our state we're a two-party consent state as well, and so we had to navigate some legislation that was going through prior to us feeling confident that we could roll a project out like this. Legislation was passed in 2015 or in 2016 that would allow us to beta test body-worn cameras, and then that legislation had a sunset clause and actually went into effect where we can minimize the people involved in an incident and just randomly requesting to look at the video. Washington state law prohibits, if you're not part of that event, that you can't just randomly do public disclosure requests. So we were feeling pretty good about that when that new law went into effect. And then, of course, policy development. How do we work our policy development with public disclosure laws and make sure that as we're out there recording general police encounters, some of those very sensitive and in some cases confidential, and people's privacy and trust in us, we didn't want that to get shattered with their lack of confidence being lost in us as the police. So we had to work cautiously through that piece. And then I think partnering with other agencies, specifically the city and county prosecutors, and what would this project look like for them. Obviously, initially there was hesitation and concern, and I guess I should have said earlier, we're still rolling this project out. It's probably 90% rolled out in the department, but it's not 100% yet. We started in December with our initial stand-up and rollout. So we're still working with the attorneys' offices, prosecutors, and defense attorneys on how best to get this information to them, and we're making great progress. And although the initial hesitation that they had with us holding their hand and walking slowly through this, and arguably we had to nudge a little bit along the way, they're coming on board, and we're getting some positive feedback from both those from the attorneys involved in this, and making sure that them and their staff are trained up. And then finally, as we come to implementation and how do we get the officers' buy-in, which is largely what this presentation is about today, and it was bringing the union and the members on board early on, spending a lot of time going over what their concerns might be. It had been mentioned before the fishing expedition. That, of course, was immediately brought up, and we found some language that we could put in that policy. And quite frankly, as the administrative staff, all of the command staff in the organization, we were concerned as well that if we did have supervisors that thought they had enough time that they could sit around and go on fishing expeditions, we thought that we probably wanted some language in to guard against that as well. I don't think we have any, but you never know. So we wanted, as the administrative staff too, we wanted some firm language that would prohibit just randomly sitting around watching videos looking for officers, maybe making a mistake or something. There's plenty of opportunities for our officers or our supervisors when they're just generally approving reports or they're involved with officers and writing and having to look at footage from a training standpoint or whatever, that they could have an auditing aspect that we were comfortable with. So that seemed to mold well into our policy with what the union wanted. We had to make sure that we had their confidence in the program, and one of those was getting their buy-in in the fact that this is going to be the opportunity for them to tell their story. I'd mentioned our controversial shooting several years before and other events up to that. Everybody in society is recording what our officers are doing anyways, but we had no opportunity for us to control from an evidentiary standpoint what that actual video footage was going to look like, and making sure that our officer's perspective was captured and portrayed in the light that it should have been. Not edited, not 3 or 4 seconds on a YouTube video, but actual evidence from our officers, from their perspective, what they were seeing. Sean had mentioned that the camera isn't as good as the actual human eye, but even worse than that is to have footage coming from an angle or from somebody else that's not what the officer is observing. So taking the time with the officers to explain that, making sure, I'd mentioned earlier that we had bought some forensic software, Input ACE, so that we could make sure that these camera footages had the forensic ability to stand on their own for our officers. And so that was one of the things that we really pushed for our officers, that this was going to be their opportunity to tell their story. And then we had them, the union, involved with us as we were looking for approval of that policy and pushing it out to the officers. And then finally, I think if you're moving down this road, or if you have moved down this road and you're in the implementation stage or you're looking at it, patience with your officers, patience with our officers. That's where we're at right now. We're doing what I call a slow rollout and taking the time. We've taken what we call super users, and each side of our patrol division, whichever shift it is, has officers that have advanced training in the operation of the body-worn cameras. They're not IT specialists, but they're a notch below that. So each shift, each side of the house has go-to super users that officers can go to with technical questions. Their on-off switch doesn't work, whatever it might be. It isn't charging correctly, and help minimize that frustration. You heard Sean talk about the story of the double tap where the camera comes on and goes off. We've experienced that here. It is a training opportunity, and I think patience and a slow rollout is paramount if you're going to see success in our program. We are seeing success, but we're continuing to move this along in a slow fashion. So with that, that's all I have. I'll turn that back over to probably Tom, who will open up for discussions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chief. Excellent information from the panel, all of you. Really well done. So we have 5 minutes remaining. Let's try and address a couple questions that have come in, and just so the group knows, if we don't get to your questions, we will provide it to the panel and reply to you via email if at all possible. So let's start with one question that was based upon the discussion. The question is to the panel, and I think we'll start with Sean, because you mentioned this, I believe, and I think everybody touched on it. What was the recommendation or thought process in letting citizens know they are being recorded? Sean, before I turn it over to you, I recently, just this past week, had a discussion with an agency, and they are implementing a camera that actually inverts the screen so the citizens can view that they're being on camera. And the agency indicates that they have information that this will reduce their use of force needs by about 70% by demonstrating that the citizens are on camera. So why don't you start with that response, Sean, about the process of thinking that behind letting citizens know?
So, what we've seen, and it's not a requirement of the law in most places, but a lot of departments have it in their policy that, and this is important language, whether it's regarding the activation or notification, it should always be prefaced with the words, whenever practicable, because, you may not have time to have that, to make that statement or to get that camera activated if you're, taking fire and you're trying to find cover and so forth. So, but in most places, officers are trained if the opportunity arises to make that part of their kind of introductory comments. So a lot of times officers, particularly state police in Illinois, when they approach a vehicle, they introduce, they say, Trooper Smoot, this is, I want you to know that I have I'm wearing a body-worn camera and our conversation is being recorded. Do you know why I stopped you? And that just, puts folks on notice. Again, it's not a requirement. What I see more of now is officers being required to deactivate their cameras in certain circumstances. So if it's a victim and they request that the camera be turned off, officers should deactivate their cameras unless they have another reason to feel that there's danger afoot or there's some bad intent on the person requesting, or if they're in a medical situation or if they're in someone's home and they're specifically requested to turn off the camera. They should do so unless the officer can articulate a reason why they didn't think it was safe to do so at the time.
Great, Sean. Any additional thoughts from the rest of the panel on that question?
I have one, Tom. So one thing is to think about the language, and I think the phrasing of the question was, could you repeat the question so I make sure I answer it exactly how it was asked?
Yeah, the thought process on a recommendation of letting citizens know they're being recorded. So basically, proactive notification that we have a body-worn camera and you're being recorded. What's the thought on that?
Sure. So one thing that's important to remember is there's a lot of different ways that you can put the language in the policy. So it certainly should be in the policy in some way, shape, or form, so officers know what they're expected to do. I think sometimes it's something that gets left out of policies, and so then officers aren't really sure if they have to say something or should they. So you can say, you must notify citizens, you should notify citizens, you may notify citizens, you should not notify citizens. I mean, that could be one too. So, and certainly there are I did that kind of in descending order, right? So officers can kind of tell what the preference of the department is by the language that's used. And so there's certainly benefits to telling people, as Sean just mentioned. And as I mentioned, with the idea that there's not going to be any change to behavior on the part of citizens if they don't know that you have a camera. And it gets lost in all the stuff that's on the vest. There's a lot of things there's a lot of black going on. And so it can be very difficult to identify that an officer has a camera, especially if you're, not from around there, or you're, driving through 16 jurisdictions to get somewhere. And so it's important for officers to have guidance, but certainly from a best practice perspective, I feel like that's where that question's going. Recommendation, it can be beneficial for officers to tell citizens. You can run into the issue that Sean mentioned about, well, what do we do then if they say they want it turned off? And then you have to have a policy for that and practice for that. But telling people can absolutely just kind of puts everyone on notice, I think, as Sean said. And so there's at least possibility that people will kind of calm down if they know that it's being recorded. Not necessarily true. I've seen the opposite happen, so, well, great, and then people get all upset about it again. So, I mean, it doesn't always happen, but I think the potential will never happen if they don't know it's on.
Thank you both, and we are out of time actually, so unfortunately we won't be able to get back to other questions. We'll do our best to follow up on that I think the response to the last question was based upon the impact that it has on behavior, which is important. So in wrapping up, we just wanted to highlight that the goal of this was to provide you with some helpful information and insights on the importance and benefits of educating your officers on body-worn camera and their buy-in. I've participated in several of these webinars, and I thought this panel was one of the best that we've had, so I want to extend my appreciation to them and the information. I also want to thank you all for participating and being attentive with this. We hope that you found it helpful, and a reminder, please complete the evaluation when you can. And in closing, I just want to acknowledge and thank Denise Rodriguez and Samantha Reinerson of CNA for their leadership and all the work behind the scenes that went into orchestrating this webinar. And I again want to thank our panelists, and I especially want to thank BJA for making this webinar possible. And with that, I'll thank you all and appreciate your time and your participation, and that will conclude today's webinar. Thank you.